Good afternoon. You're very welcome to St. Peter Mancroft, whether you're in church or watching online. If you are in church, please feel free to continue with your visit during our short weekly reflection. My name's Catherine Waddams. I'm a licensed lay minister here at St. Peter Mancroft, and today I want to talk about just transition, and I've subtitled that Fire, Freedom, Fairness, and Psephology. We had an interesting note through our letterbox a few weeks ago asking us to campaign against a proposed low-traffic neighbourhood in the vicinity. We wouldn't be part of this, and the argument was that traffic would be diverted through our street as a result. Supporters of low-traffic neighbourhoods argue that it encourages healthier walking and cycling behaviour and improves the air quality. Critics say that they harm the freedom of motorists. The Prime Minister has announced his support for such freedom, saying, "I just want to make sure people know that I'm on their side in supporting them to use their cars to do all the things that matter to them." But such freedom comes at a cost. Cars contribute to climate change, especially those which use petrol and diesel. Because it is the world as a whole which suffers from each of us burning fossil fuels, and it's so difficult to make change on our own, we need governments to actually restrict our freedoms, which is why the intergovernmental conferences and commitments are so important. But both the Conservative and Labour parties seem to have questioned the value of such rules following the recent surprise by-election result in Uxbridge and South Ruislip. This was influenced by opposition to the planned extension of the London ultra-low emission zone, which imposes fines on the use of more polluting vehicles. We've certainly had a lot of news to remind us of the dangers of pollution and carbon emissions recently. A bad fire season in North America, and flames horribly near to home in southern Europe, with July the hottest recorded month across the world, if not in Norfolk. Public opinion increasingly favours policies to tackle the problems of climate change. A recent Office of National Statistics survey reported that almost 2/3 of adults in Great Britain said they were somewhat or very worried about the impact of climate change and wanted the government to act to limit the damage. A similar proportion reported they had taken some action to help tackle climate change in the previous 12 months. Among these, you may recognise them, the most common actions were making changes to shopping habits, 2/5 of people, and travel, nearly 1/3. So why were the voters of Uxbridge and South Ruislip reluctant to accept these additional restrictions on their freedom? One reason is probably that the vehicles most affected are old, more than 18 years old for petrol cars and more than 8 years old for diesels. Their owners are therefore more likely to have lower than average incomes. So while the £12.50 a day ULEZ charge is designed to improve the air quality by reducing car use with health benefits for all, it looks and feels like a tax on the poor and raises real issues of fairness. Equity and fairness are, of course, important in their own right. "It's not fair" is a familiar cry for parents of more than one child. When my own 2 children were young, I used to feel that I'd got things about right if both Anne and Geoffrey thought a solution wasn't fair. Perhaps as adults we can take a more positive approach to fairness, even though we might each define it in different ways. Of course, much of the Bible is concerned with fairness, care for the vulnerable and marginalised, and avoiding exploitation of power, whether that's political, social, or economic. It can be quite a challenge for the Church to follow this gospel, particularly where its members are well endowed with material goods and/or are socially influential. But fairness is important not just for its own sake, but also to gain general acceptability. People who argue that trying to limit climate change and dealing with its consequences are expensive are absolutely right. It may be wise, as well as equitable, to provide some compensation to industries and workers who will lose out: the oil and gas sector, traditional motor part manufacturers. Since many of these sectors lobby against climate-friendly policies precisely because they may lose out, recognizing their position and discussing appropriate ways to help them manage change may be quite difficult, particularly if we've been campaigning against their position. I supported this PCC's recent decision to follow the Church of England decision to divest from fossil fuel companies. That doesn't mean we shouldn't listen to their arguments for help in the adjustment process to different ways of doing things. And there will be many costs for different people in adapting to new ways of doing things, whether that's acquiring electric cars, changing our gas boilers, or higher energy bills as suppliers adapt systems to new patterns of renewable energy. Accepting limits to freedom and the higher costs involved will only be possible if people feel that the burdens are distributed fairly, that they fall on the broadest shoulders. So there is a pragmatic reason to ensure that policies are designed to be demonstrably fair. Perhaps in the ULEZ case, an extension of the subsidised trade-in and scrappage arrangements for lower-income drivers would make the scheme more affordable for those who are most dependent on their cars and least able to pay higher costs. That would be one pragmatic way of making the zone more acceptable. Other environmental costs also need to be spread fairly. If they are designed to deter particular behaviour, such as burning fossil fuels, they will only be acceptable if people do not suffer hardship as a result. This isn't necessarily easy, and it's certainly worth taking time to get the policy right. I was rather impressed with our diocesan environmental policy, which imposes a very effective constraint, more a shove than a nudge to better decisions, and we've recently observed it firsthand at Peter Mancroft. When one of our 2 gas-fired boilers broke down last year, it was felt there wasn't time to explore more environmentally friendly alternatives, and it was replaced with a like-for-like gas-fired boiler. Since then, diocesan policy has changed. Now the second boiler needs replacing, and we're expected to replace it with a non-fossil fuel boiler. In our case, we're looking at an air source heat pump, considerably more expensive than a conventional gas boiler. If we wanted a like-for-like gas boiler replacement, we'd have to argue the case, and we'd be unlikely to be successful. The diocese has indeed restricted our freedom, and we are forced to spend a higher amount on a solution which is better for the environment. We are lucky that we are able to afford the higher costs. I do hope that there is some real help for poorer churches who are not so fortunate. And through this sort of policy, the diocese is not dodging the issue of environmental damage, however unpopular that may be, in the way that the Labour and Conservative parties seem to have done in the light of this surprise by-election result. Both parties are apparently willing to rethink policies which will favour public rather than private good, even though a majority of people are in favour in principle of policies which limit climate change. Ensuring fairness and acceptability would be a better reaction to the voters of Uxbridge and South Ruislip than favouring private gains over the harmful effects on planet Earth and on the ability of all God's creation to thrive.